Welcome to the Daily Dose of Septuagint. I'm excited that for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be taking a look at Psalm 22. We're heading into Easter here over the next few weeks, and this particular psalm is used a lot in the passion narratives of the Gospels. It almost functions like a screenplay for the sufferings and death and eventually resurrection of Jesus. And so going through it in detail here will be a great way for us to orient our hearts and minds to honor the death and resurrection of Jesus. So looking forward to digging into it. You'll notice on screen that Psalm 22 is actually 21 in the Greek numbering. And the versification is also off by one. That happens often in the Greek Psalter, but I'm going to stick with the English numbering because I think that's a bit more familiar. And so just be aware that it is a bit off as we go. Let's begin by reading it. We'll take a look at this first verse, and then I'll double back around to the superscript towards the end as well. So let's begin. Hotheos mu, proskesmoi, hinati enkatelepes me, makran apote soterias mu, hoi lagoi ton parpatomaton mu. Well, let's begin with the petition of the psalmist. He starts by addressing God and then my God here. And in fact, if you just sort of step back, you'll notice that the first person pronoun shows up a bunch already in this first verse. You have it here, 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 and here, with different case endings. In fact, as we get into the psalm, we're going to see it is this intense emotional conversation, really, a prayer between the psalmist here with the first person and God himself. We're going to go back and forth between the first person pronoun, the second person pronoun, me, you, I, you, etc. So just be paying attention to that as we go. So he starts with God, my God, this very impassioned address here. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. Then we have our first verb here, which is proskes, and that's from prosechos, a second singular aorist active imperative here. And prosecho typically means to attend to or pay attention to. So he's saying, as an imperative, pay attention to me. Heed me. Turn your attention to me. Now, if you're familiar with this psalm in the English rendering, you'll be aware that this very short line here, this clause, is not present in the Masoretic text. So it's not probably going to be in your English Bible. And in the Gallican Psalter, which is, in a sense, the first draft of Jerome, his first attempt at translating the Psalms, which was heavily indebted to the Greek before he went back and, in effect, retranslated with the Hebrew more in mind. It is obelized. That means it's present in the Greek, so it'll be marked with the obelisk, even though it's not in the Hebrew at Jerome's disposal. So not sure where it comes from, actually. It's early in the Greek tradition, but not sure why it was added. So that's kind of interesting. So pay attention to me. Then we have a question. Begins with hinati, which, if you just look at the constituent components, a particle of purpose or result plus the neuter form of the interrogative tis, that may not make sense, but when you put it together, it's basically why. It's this just a why is the idiom there. Another verb here, which is from ekatalepo, and ekatalepo means to forsake. This is a second singular aorist active indicative in this case. You see another es ending, and that means, again, to forsake or to abandon. So why have you forsaken, once again, me? Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. And then the psalmist goes on to say, makran, so that's far off or far away, from my salvation or my deliverance here. So that's really kind of setting up really for the punchline, are the words or the utterances of my parapatoma. Now, parapatomaton. Now, that's interesting because this typically means transgression. But in the Hebrew as we have it, it is groanings. And again, not entirely sure how the Greek translator got there from that particular Hebrew word. Typically, you'll see, far from my deliverance and the groaning that I have, something along those lines. But parapatoma is a very interesting gloss. It's not a typical translation pairing for that particular word. It does, though, in my opinion, if you just sort of look at it in terms of reception history and thinking through what early Christians might have been thinking when they read this psalm, especially because we're going to show that this verse here is used by Jesus himself, or the first half of the verse. It has a bit of a substitutionary component here. If Jesus is the psalmist, as we'll see, he doesn't have his own transgressions, but on the cross he is, in a sense, a very important sense, bearing the transgressions. He's the substitute. So maybe there's something to that. Not sure. I'd have to think about that more, but Curious to see what you think about that as well. Well, with that in mind, let's take a look at how this does show up in the Gospels. So in Matthew 27:46, we read that Jesus cried out in a megalephone, in a loud voice saying, and then here we have it, probably a rendering more or less from the Hebrew. You have Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, although that verb form is not exactly what we see in the Masoretic. Then Matthew very helpfully says that is, and he translates it to Greek, and this is where it's quite interesting. Theemu, hinati, me enkatelepes. And so you'll notice that we have the hinati. You can put those two words together. It's the same result. You have a slight reordering of the me. You got the same verb here, but what do we notice? We see Matthew's take on the initial call here, the Eli, Eli, and he puts it in the vocative. You have thea, that's the vocative of theos, and he repeats the mu. Whereas in the Old Greek, at least, the mu is present just once. So we have the nominative here plus one mu, whereas Matthew gives it as the vocative with a repetition of the mu. And that repetition is going to be pretty close to what we see in whatever he had in front of him as the Hebrew. So pretty interesting. Now let's take a look at the other option. Mark 15:34, exact same scene, just Mark's version of it. You have the boaoin again. So Jesus cried out in a phone megale, in a great voice, Eloi, Eloi. Now this is closer to the Aramaic. And so it could be there's some interference here where Mark may be getting something closer to the Aramaic, which is, in my opinion, probably what Jesus would have spoken in his final moments. Whereas Matthew here is kind of like what we might do. If we're going to quote someone who's speaking in a different language, we'll use our English Bible, so to speak, to reflect it. In this case, maybe he's drawing on the Hebrew to reflect Jesus' words in Hebrew, whereas Mark here is content to just record them as the Aramaic, because Eloi would be closer to the Aramaic. So Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. So far, so good. And then he says, which is interpreted, that's a big word, methermenoumenon, as, it can be translated as or interpreted as, and then he gives us his Greek rendering. Notice what he does, hotheosmu, hotheosmu. He's back to the nominative here, but once again, you still have the repeated mu. And then instead of hinati, he has aste, which is almost like for what purpose? And then we have the enkatelepes me as well. And this shows you that both gospel writers are reflecting the true essence of what Jesus is saying. They have slightly different renderings because, again, they're trying to bring out what he most likely spoke in a Semitic tongue. They're trying to bring that into Greek. They might also be influenced by, the Old Greek that they have in front of them, or maybe the Hebrew Bible they have in front of them. So they're trying to sort of capture his essential saying from the cross, even though they're giving slightly different spins on it, because, again, there's that interference from a different language. But regardless, the point is, in his final moments, as he's crying out in a loud voice, the powerful thing is that Jesus quotes God's word back to God. He takes the initial introduction to Psalm 22 and he makes it his own. His Father is my Father. Even in his moment of anguish, a lot of folks think, well, God's turning his face away or something like that, and we'll get into that down the road. But even in that moment of bearing the parapatoma, bearing the sins for his people, Jesus cries out to his own God and Father. And he does say, why have you abandoned me? Why are you leaving me on the cross, so to speak? But we're going to see the psalm is going to have a very powerful turn towards the end, where God does not ultimately abandon Jesus. He does not abandon the psalmist. There's a turn where there is deliverance. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we go through Psalm 22. It's very dark and bleak, and it is this cry of anguish, the cry of dereliction from the psalm placed on Jesus' lips. He is now the psalmist, but there is going to be good news towards the end. But death is going to come first. Let's just pause and take a look at the superscript, which is pretty weird. In Greek, we read it estatelas, hupertes ante lempseos tes heothenes, salmas to Dawid. Now, I covered some of this in that special video, but estatelos is translating lemnetseach, which is usually something like for the choir director or something like that. But as mentioned, if you revocalize this, it might look like unto the end, which is really interesting for this psalm because it does cast it in this eschatological flavor. The next line, the hupertes antilempseos, the word antilempsis here is help. And then heothenes is from athenos, that means early morning. So it's early in the AM. But the Hebrew there is something like doe of the dawn, which of course translators differ on that as well. So clearly the translator here had a difficult time dealing with that. Lastly, we have Psalmas to Dawid, which is Mizmor le David here. And we talked about that as well. This lamed is really nicely taken as a dative, but is it to? Is it for? Is it by? Is it about? That's the big debate on the Hebrew side. Ultimately, we know that it's actually about Jesus, the greater son of David, because he's the one who takes it on his lips. So interesting stuff in the superscript. Thanks for tuning in. I know it's been a long video, but hopefully this has been fun. A lot of really fascinating stuff in Psalm 22.